Firstly, let's look at the context of these scandals involving particularly the Tory party, although, of course, other parties have had MPs in hot water over sexual misconduct as well. What's the lay of the land today?
Well, I think that the weekend saw a number of fresh allegations made against Chris Pincher. I was trying to count them up this morning. I think there's about a dozen now of allegations of misconduct against him. And so the question now goes on to what did Boris Johnson know and when? And he's due back in the Commons today for his first time after that globe-trotting tour of Europe. Got about a dozen days out of the country, which I'm sure he enjoyed a break from. And so it now comes down to issues about what did Johnson know when he appointed Pincher to be Deputy Chief Whip, and how you can square that with some of the commentary that's been going on, because I think ministers are increasingly reluctant to go out and defend Number 10 and the Downing Street operation when the line is going to change just hours later.
Yes, it was interesting listening to Simon Hart, the Wales Secretary, on Friday morning, who did a bit of freelancing it, almost sort of suggesting that the whip would be suspended, and then it obviously became suspended later that day. I wonder, to what extent did the Prime Minister know about this? We remember back to February when there was that reshuffle, when Chris Pincher got appointed as Deputy Chief Whip. I was reading my tweets from the time earlier today, and there was a lot of remark about how long Chris Pincher remained in Downing Street. Some people thought he might be being appointed Chief Whip, and then he only ended up as Deputy Chief. I wonder what those discussions for those long hours were back in February.
Well, Chris Pincher was invaluable in the Prime Minister's survival around that time, January, February. He was part of the Operation Save Big Dog, and he is a man with formidable political intelligence and had obviously previously served as a whip himself. So clearly there were some discussions going on about what his role should be, and I think now there is a bit of consternation about what his role ended up being, which was Deputy Chief Whip, with a role for welfare and MPs, and of course he was facing these allegations and accusations at the same time. So there's some concern about letting him occupy such a prominent position in the party. And again, the question to which Boris Johnson's judge of character now comes up, and that's what's being asked by a number of MPs who, of course, on Wednesday were going to vote on the 1922 committee, which could help decide Johnson's fate.
It's interesting, though, looking at all of these different allegations, some of them dating back for quite some time, and looking at all of the different MPs that this seems to have sort of rolled into one, this big sexual misconduct scandal. I wonder, to what extent is this a Westminster problem? To what extent is this a societal problem more broadly? And to what extent can Boris Johnson himself really be blamed for what some of his 365 MPs might have got up to?
I think obviously you need to add in the qualifier that MPs have an additional spotlight on them, and which is shone on few other people to the same extent in society. But that being said, there does seem to be a rather depressing number of these kind of scandals, typically involving things to do with power structures and the knowledge that people can get away with it. I mean, obviously Chris Pincher will need to be the allegations against him need to be properly investigated, but of course all this sort of surfaced 5 years ago, some of these similar claims. So it does lead to the sense that some people can maybe get away with some things which others in society can't. And I think it's noticeable that what's really telling in some of these things is the relationship between staff and MPs, and there's a 20-year age difference with the power that brings in. Some people talk about the alcohol culture in Westminster. I think that's a slight factor, but I would also add that some of these allegations against Pincher were people premises off away from Westminster, Carlton Club or the Midland Hotel in Manchester as well.
It's interesting that, of course, Chris Pincher denies those allegations, and there will now be investigations. But I wonder to what extent the structure of MPs' offices is played into this, because they're very small teams. It's members of Parliament with maybe 2 staff, perhaps 3 staff, perhaps, in Westminster itself. I just wonder that were MP offices more similar to the offices of members of other legislatures around the world, larger teams, perhaps structures within those teams rather than just sort of an MP and a junior staffer sitting close together in some fusty office. If these were potentially larger teams, better structured, better funded, might we avoid some of these situations?
I think there's a very good case for that right now, looking at some of the HR problems that have happened over the past decades, and there have been constant calls for reform, for a really independent agreements process. Because, of course, if you've got a complaint against your MP, the only person you can take it to is your MP, who's your line manager. And you get some fantastic MPs with their staff, but you get others who, as we've seen time and time again, don't have that kind of respect for their members of staff. And equally, also, there's a good legislative case for it, which is that if you had MPs with, say, even maybe a fraction of what the resources that congressmen in America get, you could see much better scrutiny of the bills which Parliament is debating, which government's trying to ram through, and actually you've just got one overworked caseworker and one undersourced researcher.
And it is extraordinary also that these people are paid through MPs' expenses, technically. So then you get all these websites showing MPs claiming £300,000 of expenses. Well, actually, that's the staffing budget, not what they themselves use. Just finally on this point, I wonder to what extent the way in which that structure could be changed. Currently, we have the situation where lots of MPs have maybe 2 or 3 staffers, one of whom calls themselves a chief of staff in some sort of peculiar way, and is no such thing in any meaningful sense of the word. What's the possibility for actual reform to the structure of MPs' offices?
Well, I'm quite a cynic about this, I'm afraid. I very much doubt much will happen, and we're going to keep talking about these scandals for a very long time to come, sadly. There's so many issues facing the country right now. Understandably, some of the people watching this might wonder why MPs are obsessing on navel-gazing, but I also think that there's powerful incentives in retaining the existing structure, so I'm very pessimistic about any kind of change happening anytime soon.